How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts! My soul longs, indeed it faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh sing for joy to the living God. In season 1 of the Dwelling Place podcast, this longing took me on a 6-month journey around the UK to dwell with a variety of intentional Christian communities, sharing interviews with community members, leaders and founders along the way. In this second season of the Dwelling Place podcast, I invite you to join me in the US as I occasionally visit intentional Christian communities and share community-related interviews in the midst of my seminary education. In sharing these conversations, exploring the blessings, challenges, and wisdom of intentional Christian communal living, I hope to share glimpses of the transforming presence of the living God and inspire how it is we might be called to contribute to making God's kingdom manifest on earth, enabling people, God's beloved, to experience God's loving dwelling place.
Hello, my name is Sorcha.
Thank you for being here, Sorcha. So I met Sorcha in London in 2023 when I was doing a pilgrimage across communities through my husband, Demarius. And Sorcha has been a part of a number of communities for the past 20 plus years. So unlike other episodes, we're not going to go through necessarily just one community, but we'll be looking into Sorcha's community journey and have some more holistic conversation about community in general, residential community versus dispersed community. I know that Sorcha has a lot of thoughts, a lot of experience, and so I'm really looking forward to learning from that and just exploring together. So Sorcha, how about you tell us how you first got involved with intentional Christian community, and then we'll go into the the whole number of communities you've been a part of and why.
The entire thing, the entire list. I'll keep it short for my introduction. It's lovely to be here. I love speaking to you. So thank you so much for asking me to be on your podcast. So I was born in Belfast originally, but moved to England as a child. And but I was very aware of the differences between Christians, especially because we use the terminology Catholic and Protestant an awful lot. And within my family grouping and with the society that I was sort of part of in one way. And so I knew I was craving something, but I didn't know what it was. And I think what I was craving was a sense of reconciliation and what that looked like on a lived perspective. I didn't want it intellectual. I didn't want it light touch. I wanted it deep inside my bones and soul. And the church I was part of, the Catholic church I was part of in England, did a trip to Taizé every year. And I went along when I was 17. And sitting in that church with all these different Christians praying together, I was like, whatever this is, this needs to be bottled. It's like a stock cube of beauty. And it really got into the marrow of my bones. And it led me in a very different direction of life than I thought I would be in. Not that I knew what I was going to do, but I knew I was going to do it well. Haven't done that either. But it meant that I returned to Taizé over many years, often for a couple of weeks, up to a month every summer. But when I turned 28, various things happened that meant that I could actually go to Taizé and live as a volunteer. And that was my first lived experience in community, was to live in Taizé in France, alongside many other, hundreds of other volunteers. And within that time, they also sent me to some other places. One of the places was a community in Rotterdam. So doing the same kind of style of prayer and community, but in Rotterdam. And then when I left Taizé, the community had also started something in Brussels. So I joined that for 5 months. And I realized when I left how deeply I loved just living with other lay people in this shared experience of mutual understanding and Christian trust. So when I started to study my master's I went back to Belgium to do it. I joined a community and lived in a community whilst I was studying called the Damien Community. That was more of a student community with like philosophy students, mainly Americans, and then theological students, which was a random bunch of people who wanted to live in a community. So it's like a step up. We'll come back to that. And that finished with my studies. So I came back to England and I was Googling, literally was like monastic communities in London, lived community, ecumenism. I was trying my best to find some kind of space where difference could live together. And the community of St. Anselm popped up out of nowhere. And I had read a book, I'd heard of a book called The City is My Monastery, by Richard Carter, Reverend Richard Carter. And I'd been like, oh, that book's interesting. I'll come back and read it. And then realized that it kind of called to me in some way about how is it to be in a city, but to be in a community and to live and work and to be non-residential, which I'd never done before. So when I joined the St. Anselm community, which is also for a year, that felt very much like a somewhere in between, very much in between the lived on the site experience and the doing it at home. This was the middle ground. And I was a member for 3 years. And then I got old, so I left. There are age cutoffs for a lot of these community experiences. And then found the Nazareth Community, which is at St. Martin in the Fields, which the Reverend Richard Carter had written his book about. The city is his monastery, so I have just started to get in touch with them. I'm not a vowed member yet. So there's a lot there. There's a lot there.
There is a lot there. I love how you described Taizé as a stock cube of beauty. That's beautiful. So yes, a lot there. So if we wind back to Taizé, would you mind describing what kind of residential community that was in France? Because it's quite large and I'm guessing quite structured, international. So whether you can give us a flavour of what that community was like.
The basic framework of Taizé as a place is that it only started during World War II in the mind of one man, which was Brother Roger, who was a Swiss Protestant. And he moved to a Catholic country, which is France, to the most rural place you could think of that didn't have much running water, didn't have anything. And he felt very driven by a dream. And for the first sort of 15 years, it was quite a place that people could feel that they could come to because he was living a system of prayer 3 times a day. You know, he and his friends that came back after the war made yearly vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But, you know, they didn't expect to kind of make lifelong vows or to maybe stay their whole lives, or maybe some would go off and get married. He has this thing called the provisional, like the sort of the spirituality of the provisional, and how things don't have to stay static and traditional. They can actually move and grow and change, but you don't lose that central charism. And for him, the central charism was about, in many ways, that peace and reconciliation through lived experience and difference, and being a listening ear without judgment. And at some point, it was at 1973, they welcomed their first Catholic brother. And now there's over 80 different Protestant backgrounds and Catholic men who live as a sign of like a visual sign of reconciliation, unity through difference and diversity. They don't give up where they come from, their culture or their background or their country or their denomination, to live together in harmony. Sometimes it's not harmonious, it's a community. The reason why I mention this is the Taizé brothers are the core. They are people who vowed it for life. Then step outside of that, like a circle, like an onion. Then you have the people that live in the Taizé community who help out. You also have people that live in the village who aren't connected at all, but they're around. And then you have the people that live there as volunteers for a year or more. And they're the ones that help shore up the logistics. They're the ones that are helping with the rubbish collection and the ones that are helping with the cooking and the really big things. You know, cooking for sort of 5,000 people. You've got to get someone to stir the smash. You know, the sort of fake mash. Then you have the people that come for a couple of months. They're the next stage down. Then you have the ones that come for a couple of weeks. Then you have the people right on the outside. The biggest circle are the ones that come for the week. And in many ways, the ones that come for the week are the ones that it's all tailored towards, because they get a little doorway into being in Taizé. They join the brothers in their rhythm of life. There's, some communities, they say you can join us for prayers, but then that's kind of it. Or in this, it's, you eat the same time, you kind of pray at the same time. Everyone's got work to do, and there's the prayers are 3 times a day, and you get assigned a piece of work, and you get some spiritual injection of Bible introduction and small groups, and you get to work and play and do all the manner of things with each other. And that's the framework of Taizé. So in terms of those volunteers, like I said, the sort of lines of volunteers means the ones that are there the longest end up doing some of the more deeper ops late level stuff. But they also create a little community amongst themselves. So you end up with people that actually you journey with for the whole year. Or maybe they came in March and you joined in September, and they leave in December and you leave next March, but you cross over each other. And we saw that mostly during the first lockdowns, because that meant a lot of the people from the outside all disappeared, and it just went down to just the brothers and the people that could stay a bit longer or couldn't leave for various reasons. And I think for the first time ever, really, a lot of people that came to Taizé realized that the core is the brothers, not their experience of being like a brother for a week, or even and that really fed a lot of my understanding of community life. Was I was always aware that someone somewhere else had done this for life. They were vowing this, they were giving up, they were sacrificing to answer that call.
Thank you. That was a very coherent description of a community, because I always find it very difficult to describe all of the layers, all of the onion layers. And I guess my question, and it's a bit of maybe a theme which might emerge from this podcast, or that you've already mentioned, is the sense of timelines and cutoff points. And so in the Taizé community, if you're male, you have the option of taking the lifelong vow and becoming a brother. As a lay woman, what is the cutoff? Could you be a part of that kind of semi-core lay community? Or is there a prescribed cutoff? And my associated question is, I've been to other communities, for example, Iona, Scargill. I haven't been to Liabi, but it's also of this ilk of there's a core community doing the cooking, the cleaning, the beds, and guests come for a week or so. But it's also quite intense rhythms. So in my head, I thought that, it makes sense that maybe people just stay for 3 years max, because it's a really intensive rhythm. You're not working outside jobs, you're stipended. And so I was like, maybe it has to be transient. But I'm interested in your reflections on that, of like whether it's like, no, actually, I think it could work if people were there for a lifetime.
It's a very interesting question. And I think there's a real difference between lay spiritual community and which I think a lot of different lay people can be part of different ages and different backgrounds and knowledge. And then there's this other type of like a vowed religious community who's at the core of things, and to whom major decisions get made. This is the thing about Taizé, is that even though it's incredibly warm and understanding and welcoming, and they really listen to everybody, the ultimate final decisions are made by the brothers, really. And actually within the brothers, there's a core group that would most likely make some of the big decisions, because 80 people, when they tried to decide on a new prior, a new leader, it took quite a long time, because they wanted to listen to everybody. But in the end, they got to sort of make the decision within themselves. And the people outside of every level, apart from the core brothers, were not involved in that conversation. Now, if you are living in a more spiritual community where you have, a bit like Iona, where you have a lot of people of different stages, and you've got certain roles that need to be taken over by certain people at certain times. If you're like, we need a gardener for 3 years, we'll give you reduced accommodation. You come here and your job is that, and then you also join the spiritual community. It's a different thing, I think, because another part of the Taizé way is that it's very much a way of life. And I remember a while ago, a friend of mine from Hong Kong, and he came to England, and he was lamenting a little bit that there was no third order of Taizé. And I said, anyone that wears a Taizé cross is a third order, because you're reminded constantly that it's a part of a way of life, an ethos that one can that knows exists, it can live by, and we can live, expand or contract our connection to Taizé depending on what we're doing in our life experience because the brothers are doing it 24/7. There isn't a, oh no, Bob has broken his leg and so therefore we don't have a ferry to get to Iona, therefore there's no way of like this. And another thing that the brothers do is that they expect to do all of it themselves in some way. Like there's a thing of they're all taught how to basically do everything. So they change their jobs quite often, their roles in the community. So one, they get to be in touch with other people and sometimes they'll have a whole summer hanging out with young people, doing Bible instructions, and they might do 2 or 3 years in another community in Cuba, or they might get sent to Ukraine, and then they might come back and just be running the money for a bit. And I'm saying that light touch, and I know if a brother is listening, they'll be like, that's not how it runs. And what I'm trying to explain is it's not like you come in and you were an accountant, therefore you are the accountant brother until you are in your 80s. There is a teaching between each other about what it is. And the thing is, if a young person is assigned a job and they can't do it, a brother needs to just get on with it and do it because that's how it works. So they kind of, the reason why I also like them is that they have kind of emotional and spiritual muscles. Like they get in there in the muck. Like they've got a shovel right next to you as you're digging the trench. They're not like telling you how to do it often. They're like in there doing it and then they really appreciate the help. And I think that way of doing community is also key because that's also to do with prayer. It's like prayer doesn't stop if you're not there, right? And that's what, like I said, people discovered in the lockdowns. They were like, oh, the Tezzy brothers are still praying. What did you think they were doing? Like, and that really helped my prayer in different other lived community experiences because some of them require the group to make a consensus, a group of people who don't know each other and from different cultures and different backgrounds to decide on how to do a prayer or how a certain thing works. And I think it's really driven my whole life trajectory of trying to understand difference has been how do you do that kindly and respectfully, but also you're held accountable and you get those decisions done. Because some places those decisions don't happen.
Yeah. And Taizé has a ministry of ecumenism and also towards young people. And so what they tell you, ideally get to Taizé before you're 30, is what I've been told, I think. Can you be part of the lay community making the mash or the smash above 30, or is that community restricted age-wise?
It's a very good thing to mention, and it's not really talked about enough until you reach that threshold. But for men who want to go volunteer, it's 35, maybe even later if you've been known beforehand. If you're a woman, the cutoff is about 29 at a real push. That is partly because one, there are many more women than men who volunteer, and the women are not looked after by the Brothers of Taizé. They're looked after the Sisters of St. Andrew, a completely different community that's Catholic, whereas Taizé is like truly ecumenical. And they live in the next village called Amini, and they come over and they will minister to the young women, which is a good idea. But there's a lot more women than there are men. At one point, I think it was like 30 of us to 11 men. And therefore, when it's the summer, it expands so much that you just have a majority and there's lots of discussions about why that is. The roles of women in churches, roles of women always look all very aware of need. And sometimes gentlemen are not so aware until they're asked to be needed. And so you end up with the people that really want to volunteer and give time. And also you have to go through a set of protocols. You don't just turn up and say, I want to volunteer. You have to have a conversation with a brother or a sister. They have to listen to why you want to do it. They say, okay, come for a week or two, maybe come for a couple of weeks, and then they just roll it and roll it and roll it. Unless you come from very far away. If you come from like Hong Kong or Australia, they'll obviously make different provisions. Or if you have a visa, they will be like, come for 3 months. And I think the reason why also keeping it younger is just how it started. A lot of young people just showed a lot of interest, especially in the 1969 sort of late 1960s, early 1970s, the great big boom of the student revolution, I think meant Taizé just became a place where people could go, even if they didn't feel Christian or didn't go to church or didn't feel part of anything. They felt a drive to understand themselves spiritually. But yes, it is a bugbear for a lot of women that they can't go at a certain age. And I am I upset? I'm glad I went when I went, but my God, if I could go back to myself at 17 and just be like, would you just go now? Like do your year now. Okay, just do it. Just do it in your early 20s because then you can build on it and experience other parts of Taizé as time goes on. Doing it at 28 meant that I turned 30, I turned 30 just after I arrived back, and it meant that I could only go back for a year, 1 week once a year from then on. And that was really tough for me to accept.
Yeah. And do you still go back for a week though?
I do. I do. I'm going in August. The opportunity, like Teze also goes to a European city every Christmas time. It's called the European Meeting, and it was a way that uh, when the walls came down and when things changed in the late 80s, early 90s in the east of Europe, and they said, oh, why don't we go to a European city and then you can come to us rather than having to come all the way to Teze because some couldn't do it. And it really, a lot of the Eastern Christians loved it, so that's what they did. Um, and so that's another way of getting of being helped. But I guess the reason why we're talking about it in relation to community is that you get so many friends who are volunteers alongside you that you build another little community around you of friends who have been through a community experience. And it is very intense experience to go through. So for some people, that's their friends for life. A lot of people are still very connected to their Teze friends to this day,
Including you?
including me.
And then staying on Taizé, you then kind of did Taizé not in Taizé for a bit?
Yeah, so the idea of everything being provisional, everything being a bit temporary, which means it has flexibility to learn, but it also means you can let it go at the end if it doesn't work out. Or if it does work out, one of the great things about Taizé is that I think a lot of people, when they first come, they go, this is amazing. Why don't we just make this what we do in our diocese, what we do in our country? And sometimes it works for a period of time and then it just cools. And you just got to let it just sometimes cool. And then the next group of people who are interested, it might bubble up again in a couple of years. One year we had Taizé prayer in Westminster Abbey because then Archbishop Rowan Williams was going to Taizé all the time and he was very connected to it, so he could pull some strings. The next time we had a Taizé prayer in England that was a big national one was in like some small church in Waterloo, I think it was. So, you've got to allow it to expand and contract. Um, and one of their projects was the Small Fraternities Project, where they would send, like they do already, the Taizé brothers send groups of brothers to other communities when they're invited. So, say the Lakota in 2015, I think they invited some Taizé brothers to come live alongside them for a few months and just be with them in their space. People, there's the communities in Brazil, there's some in Bangladesh, and these are brothers that are sort of sent to scope it out, and then they just become a presence there. So they pray 3 times a day, but they also their work is related to the context that they're in. So what they do in Bangladesh is not what they're doing in Ukraine or what they're doing in Korea and South Korea. They're living right on the edge of the border, so they're with the border people. They always go into places of difficulty, but they bring Taizé with them. They bring the Taizé light with them, but they also build contextually and they learn the language where they're there. So the Small Fraternities Project was an attempt to get young volunteers to do something similar in a very short way because they had so many requests. So the one that I was sent to, I really wanted to go. I wanted them to send me to Jerusalem. Not that Jerusalem had invited them. I was like, please, can I go? And they were like, you know what, we're going to send you to Rotterdam instead. And I was like, Rotterdam? And I had to be like, that's okay, because one has to say yes to God no matter what. So I was in Rotterdam for 2 months, right in the middle of my Taizé time. And Rotterdam had had a European meeting in the past, so it already had a Taizé framework. But my job was to stay with the Zusters van Liefde, which is the Sisters of Love, next to the Paradise Church, the Paradijskirk, and do Taizé prayer in there 3 times a day for anyone that wanted to come, to work with the young people that were already part of that church, and to visit everyone that invited us to go visit them. So all the different denominations, some of them invited us to their churches, some invited us to do talks and whatever. But also the other people working on the ground. It's a very Taizé thing. You go, it's called the Small Communities project was that you went with empty hands. All you gave was your time. You lived on other people's experiences in their own homes or in their own spaces. You ate what you could when it was offered, or when you could pay for it. Um, and that was kind of it. So I also did I spent a lot of time with the Sisters of Mother Teresa who were running a shelter. After a while, they said, "Can you come pray with us every day?" So then I was doing a lot of prayer in between. Or like there's another community, the Dominicans invited to do so it became like you become the sort of broker between different communities and also the sort of glue because they're like, oh, Taizé prayer will come to your place for that. And that was temporary. I mean, that was 2 months. The whole point was it was 2 months. And I found it interesting, difficult, interesting.
And how was because then you went more as and you went in community in during those 2 months? Like you were an individual bringing the gifts of the Taizé community at large, but you yourself weren't living in residential community. Like you were the prayer anchor or you
Yeah.
were the prayerful anchor, but you didn't have the support of praying that anchor with other people who are used to praying that anchor. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, I totally understand. And it's a great question because I think with all community life, there are concentric circles and there are but calls within calls of vocation. And with this specifically, I came from the Taizé volunteers of that year who lived in Taizé. I was sort of me and two others, one who lived with me and one who had been a volunteer in the past, who just had free time, had signed up to this project. We were put together, we didn't know each other very well. And we would just go like, and it was very simple. It's like, here is your train ticket. It's been pre-booked. This person will pick you up from the train station. They will take you to wherever they're going to send you and they will look after you. So you had to be a grown up. You had to really not expect someone to baby you. And something I've really experienced in the Taizé community is I don't feel that way. That I don't feel like I've been treated like an adult, expected to act like an adult. Some community experiences I've been in, it's been a bit patronizing and a bit babying. And that could have also been my age. I mean, I was by that point 28, 29, whereas if I joined when I was 18, I don't know, I probably wouldn't, but they were very careful about who they picked for the small fraternities projects, the Taizé community. So I lived in a temporary little community of three, in a community of four elderly nuns, which are the Sisters von Liefde, the Sisters of Love, next to a church that had its own old Catholic community that I think it also shared with the other Catholic community, of which those people sometimes came to our prayers and sometimes they didn't. So we were a temporary community on top of many other communities. And then we went out and met other communities like the Sisters of Mother Teresa and the Dominicans, as well as church communities, evangelicals and Coptic Christians and bishops and whatever. So you kind of have to remember the light of where you came from and your own charism. And that with Taizé was easy because the brothers hold it. So I'm on the outlier of it. Whereas if you don't quite know what you're coming back to, I think sometimes this sending out wouldn't always work because you'd go out to Brazil for 5 years and then you'd be like doing Taizé prayer, but you'd start to maybe think your own thought, like your own direction and build it in your own way. And yeah. And the brothers are quite, in some ways, flexible with that in terms of how people feel. Like people change their minds. Not everybody stays being a brother. Not everyone stays being a volunteer.
Yeah, thank you. And then you went to Belgium
Did.
and you were part of a student community.
I've got another community between that. It might be helpful for me to give some dates, just ages as well, I think would be helpful. So when I first went to Taizé when I was 17, I absolutely and utterly adored it. I adored every single moment. Like it just like it arrested me. I felt like I'd been taken hostage very quickly. And I was like, sign me up. And I remember asking the priest at the time, I was like, my parish priest who brought me, I was like, how do I stay forever? He said, you can't stay forever. You're not a man. And I was like, okay, how do I do this? And he went, there is nowhere else like this. And I believed him wholeheartedly. And in some ways I have found that is true. But I kind of wish I'd really explored religious life at that age because I definitely had a call to something community driven. And all the way through my 20s, I um, had relationships. I tried to have careers. I say careers. I was just trying out jobs. I was just trying out being in my 20s. And there was always something slightly missing. And the reason why I bring this up is to put me into context as to why I ended up getting into community life. Um, I remember at one point I was living in London and I was living a very London life. I was sort of 26, 27, 28. And I was working for a big, famous newspaper corporation. And that involved going to a skyscraper every day and wearing heels. And, there's lots of cocktails. And it was a tabloid newspaper. So everyone was so fast talking, lots of phones going everywhere and people being arrested out of the building. And it was just all madness. And then I was in a group of friends who were living their London life or becoming doctors and lawyers and that sort of thing. And I was in a relationship, and so therefore my life was just revolved around like this sort of social life and the parties and whatever. And I always remember one of the key memories from that is I was loving it, but I was also there was a little something wasn't quite. I felt like if I kept engaging in this direction of worlds, then I would be something was missing. Not everything, but just something was calling me. And I was walking through Covent Garden, and there's a Catholic church in Covent Garden. It's down some steps, and has a little flag outside of it. And I wasn't going to a church by this point. Most of my 20s, I've been in and out of them, but I mainly made Taizé, going to Taizé in the summer, my church time. And I was in high heels, tiny little sparkly dress, and it was the height of the summer, and I was clattering along, and I saw this church, and I thought, and there's like a pizza place opposite, there's a bar at the end, and everyone's going past the cobblestones, and I was like, I'll just pop in and pray. And I sat in there for like an hour in silent prayer. And then I got up and left again, and I was like, oh, that's what I needed. I was hungry, and now I'm nourished. And of course, I also felt like if I was to become a sister at that age, I would have felt like I was missing out a little bit on the outside world. I hadn't quite had enough of both. So, but I fully did not expect at all. I thought my Taizé days were over. Honestly, honestly, honestly. I got to 28 and got on the bus from London to Taizé, which doesn't exist anymore, sadly. The straight bus. And I bumped into a friend on the bus and she said, how are you? And I said, you know what? I think I'm getting a bit too old for this now. This community stuff, like this pretending to be a monk thing. Like, is that what I'm doing? And I kept sort of really arguing with myself about the meaning. She's like, why are you trying so hard? Just let it flow over you. It's just something that we do and it's how we feel. We do a little bit of this ecumenism. And I was like, I don't want to do a little bit. I want it to be my entire life. I don't know how to do that, but I didn't really say that. But I also thought, do I? I'm really liking my London life. And I got to Taizé and got into the church like I always do. And there was all these younger people around me. There's lots of French students that week. And I was like, God, I'm old. And I thought, maybe it's not for me. And the first hum of all of the speaking calms down just before the first note comes from Taizé. And somewhere between the calm and the note, it felt like God just put a massive bell and whacked me on the head with it. And my entire psyche just vibrated with the resonance of actual God. Like there was God who I always felt like I was reaching for. I didn't have to reach. God was right in me, back to that marrow of the bones feeling again. And it was like God it's like he just shattered all the cards around me and said, no more. It's time you're here. Now. I was like, now? Now? No, 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 not now. No, 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 I'm done. I'm done. Not now. No, 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 I'm busy. I have life. And he's just like, no, it's now. And it was such a strong call, and I didn't know what it meant. So I spoke to some people in Taizé about it, and they were like, well, we shall discover. I was like, what does that mean? And I went back to England, and my boyfriend and I ended our relationship within that week. My landlord gave me notice on the flat I lived in. He wanted to sell it, so I had a month to get out, and my job made me redundant. All within the week after I came back, and I said, "Okay, God, I hear you." And I just put all my stuff in someone's attic, got a one-way ticket, and arrived in Taizé. And when I arrived, I remember going back to the same spot, and I was like, "I'm here, just as you ordered. I'm ready." I didn't hear anything. And I was so eager to please that I threw myself into Taizé life. And that was October to December. And then January, February, they sent me to Rotterdam. And the rest of the spring and summer, all the way up to September 2015, I was in Taizé as a long-term sort of volunteer. So when I left, I was 30. I was very aware that I was too old. I was getting too old. And the sisters kept making pointed, and I had no idea what to do next. But I had trusted that God would lead me in that direction. He'd lead me back out of it. Didn't lead me back out of it. I went home and promptly got incredibly depressed, which is something we need to talk about, maybe not right now, but later in the podcast. The fallout of leaving a residential community is possibly, I've had many a breakup. This is worse than a breakup. It's like a life up. It's a life down. It's something in it. You let God into the marrow of your bones. When God goes, that core part that lives within the very core of you just sort of gets dry and arid all overnight, and that's hard. So through that time, I had friends who had felt the same, and they said, "Oh, did you know there's a community in Brussels?" And I said, "A community in Brussels? What do you mean?" And they said, "Oh, the sisters have just started supporting Poverello."
And can you tell us more about Poverello?
Poverello is an organization, I think it's a charity that's based in Belgium that helps people who are homeless, but it's a very specific way of doing it. It's not like it's like empowering people upwards. So, and they have houses all over Belgium. And the one I was in was one of the main houses. The Poverello community is run mainly by volunteers. And they have places where people can stay overnight, places where people can come and eat, people can come and learn about things. And the Taizé, the Sisters of St. Andrew, said, "Oh, we've got these volunteers that come from Taizé that leave and kind of need something to do next. Like, why don't we have a lived residential experience? Why don't we put some young people, give them a couple of rooms in the big main sort of Poverello house, and they will help the volunteers. They will do prayer 3 times a day, but it's not a Christian organization. Even if it is, don't quote, yeah, it might have come from that, but when I was there, it wasn't based around spirituality or prayer. And a lot of the volunteers had been there 25 plus years. They were like, "No, I do the washing up on Wednesdays and that is it. So don't touch what I do." So I went from being very needed and constantly being told this is my job. So when I left Taizé, there's a couple of months where it was a very fallow time for me at home. And then I went to Poverello. And that was, yet again, that's a community that's very established of volunteers. They help a temporary community of very different people who are living very different economic lives to come and experience some of the things they offer. And then you have this little group of very eager young people who often don't speak the same language, who are running a Taizé prayer 3 times a day in the local chapel, and then trying to help. And I felt very sort of out of place being like, "Hello, terribly sorry, I'd love to give you a hand." And everyone would be like, "We don't need you." So they would sometimes sit us down and say, like, "Can you peel 100 apples, please?" And we'd eagerly sit down and do it. But it also showed me how now it's still going. It's been going for 9, 10 years now. The Poverello, the Taizé community, you can find them on Facebook. And they do very well. Like, I understand that but I was there right at the inception, and it really showed up some of the problems that you can have with trying to insert yourself into an already established community as young people as well. And we had no adult living on site who was in charge of all of us. It was very much like by this point, you're like a hardened volunteer, not just someone who's casually like, "Oh, I'll pop in and I'll look like I'm helping people." So they were like, "No." So yes, so that was Poverello. I was Poverello for 5 months, and I think I was there because I missed Taizé so much, and I also really wanted to make some kind of difference, but I didn't know what that was. And I had a bunch of people who I'd volunteered with in Taizé who all went off to Greece because that was when the first wave of the rubber boats that's been happening for many years, but it became news, and there were lots of people, and they were out there wading into the water and dragging people back out, and helping, mothers and babies who've been nearly drowned, and I was like, I don't feel like I'm not doing enough, and yet I was living in a community looking after homeless men over 50, and it didn't feel like enough. And I think I burnt out my what is a good person role with myself. I found that quite difficult to manage. Um,
Yeah. And how was it being part of a kind of non-Christian kind of community and a kind of Christian appendage? How did that feel? And then did it satisfy that kind of hunger for more? Did it help fill the Taizé hole? Um, or not?
um, so I just Googled Poverello to remind myself if it had a. I'm sure it did have a Christian background. I'm sure it does actually have a Christianity attached to it that I've been through a few more communities since, so I apologize if right this second I can't remember off the top of my head. But um, the thing is, I'm glad I went to Rotterdam before I went to Poverello, because in both of those, it wasn't like people were glad to see us. We were just sort of additions to their already system and schedule of life. And I wonder with temporary lay youth communities, which is anyone between 18 and 35, that sometimes try, like when they have a list of things that people should do in community, they're like, oh, we should pray and we should have fellowship and we should work in the community. It is exhausting if you've been if you've been a long-term volunteer to have to teach a young person who's going to leave in 5 minutes. Like honoring that and understanding that is helpful. And then also honoring and understanding that there are people that have been there longer. But in the end, you've even as a long-term volunteer versus a new young pup who comes in who's new to the whole thing, you always keep coming back to the basics, and that's really, really useful. I think it's really good to keep remembering and keep reminding ourselves why the F we're doing this in the first place and what it means to be the body of Christ with each other. And the other thing I noticed with working in a place that was 90% supporting homeless people who had some serious, serious issues was that because they had so many problems, sometimes the problems in the community had to be dealt with in a different way because there are some people in the community, in the small Taizé community who were there, felt like their problems weren't as big, therefore they shouldn't talk about them. And I was like, if you have beef with someone, we need to talk about it and do it well. And so helping others helped ourselves. That was really helpful to recognize. I don't think I answered your question, but I hope that was enough.
So do you feel that in that experience, your experience and wisdom about living in an intentional Christian community came out in terms of having to onboard newer people into it?
Yeah, very much so. And that was different to when you're in Taizé and people come for the week because in some ways the schedule is already set up for them. They almost there's thousands of them too, so that it's a very clean, very good system. I mean, Taizé brothers are able to arrive into a new city they don't know, and within a year welcome, like in Rome, they welcome 45,000 people to Rome between like 28th of December to the 1st of January in 2012, as an example. Like these things are enormous. And they often ask people to open their doors for free. They go to parishes and say, could you put a sofa bed? Could you give out your spare room to a bunch of, you know, tall Dutch teenagers? Like, and you don't know who you're getting until the day. You turn up and you're just given an address and off you go. Like it's that simple. And sometimes we forget that the simple actually is the easier route and is actually the more holy route. Holier route than trying to get stuck in systems and strategy, but also having a clear reason why we're doing it in the first place. And the reason, just going into the European meetings for a minute, that's called a pilgrimage of trust on earth. So if you're like, always refer back to I work in comms, right? So I'm like, what is your key brand? What is your messaging? What is your vision statement? Are we making the pilgrimage of trust on earth through everything we're doing? And actually, every time they review it, probably every year, they go, did we do that with this? What worked? What didn't? So they've become very good at it. When you do something like that in a place like Poverello, there's a system that already exists without me. My existence is not required or needed, as a volunteer, I mean. But part of it's also intergenerational warming up between different peoples. I feel like you need to ask your question again. I've gone off tangent.
It's all interesting things, and I think I've forgotten what the original question was.
Yeah, it was really good. No, it was. I went off about European meetings, but I really should have gone back to Poverello. It was about whoever's listening to this, and they're like, just go back to, you've heard it, we haven't. Well, we did.
I think were we talking about yeah, like kind of sharing your experience of intentional Christian community with younger members.
That was it. Is like, how do you do the initial welcome, and how do you, this is it's back to, I did answer it. It's about having a clear vision and knowing who you are and what you're aiming for, but allowing the temporary provisionalness of the fact that people grow, live, and die, communities grow, live, and die, and also the needs expand and contract. So you don't have a thing where you're like, we will provide two young people to help you every Monday for 8 months. If you ever run a community kitchen or a charity shop, like that stuff actually isn't as helpful as you might think it is. And that's why the people who end up being volunteers of anything end up being retired and doing it for a long time, but then their rhythm gets very static and they don't move from it. They need surety. They need something to, that's the thing they go and do. Young people are not in that space. They're all discovering who they are and what they want to do and who they want to be. Being in a small religious community of the Taizé group within the larger group of Poverello, which was majority about social justice and about helping people. Our prayers were not the center of why we were doing it. It was a very helpful place to come together and then expand from it and then come together. But the volunteers and the people who were homeless did not often, or not at all, sometimes come to our prayers. It was feeding us to keep us going. That helped me much later on. Where sometimes I was in communities, I was like, this is all very well and lovely and, and a bit tea and cakes, but we need to feed ourselves to feed others. How do we feed ourselves and nourish ourselves spiritually to then be able to go out and feed without it being, I'm teaching you how. I know better because you don't. I'm this, people also idolize people who've lived in religious communities or anybody that's lived in any form of non-traditional stuff. They're like, oh my God, you must be so holy. You've lived as a monk in Bali for like 8 months. It's like, yeah, and then I left. Doesn't mean I didn't like it or that does that make sense? There's a sort of understanding, and it's sometimes breaking through people's assumptions about age, about meaning, and that can't always be on the responsibility of the young person who's gone, I would love to live in a community. What does that mean? And then suddenly they have a barrage of other people's expectations of them. So there's another part, which is how do you welcome people into a space that's already established? And how do you actually help the local community rather than lip service or tick box or even just well-meaning? There's a lot of well-meaning people out there who have never volunteered in their lives, who really have never really really volunteered for things. It would be nice if a young person just took over the church newsletter for a couple of months, like my nephew could do that for a few weeks. No, I'm sorry, but that doesn't help in the grand scheme of things. What you need is 4 or 5 people doing the same job and they take it on rota but they do it long term for some things.
Thank you. Is this a good stand-up point?
Yes, please. A good moment to just stand around and move a bit. Right, so we got to Poverello. So yeah. I finished there in April 2015. So I had left my London life in October 2014. So I had been on a bit of a roller coaster of like lived community experiences by this point. And I always feel like a little bit like I washed up the shoreline, high tide, and it left me there beached whilst the tide went away. And that was partly because of money and finances, because even though, as an aside, the Taizé experiences that I had, they're like, we'll give you food and accommodation, be incredibly basic, like prepare to eat ham a lot, if you're all bred. But if you have the things that would normally keep you from doing things like that, which is like, how do I fund it? Where do I live? They're like, we'll sort that out. You'll live with these people or do this thing. What you give is your time, and younger people have a lot of time. And they're also searching for something. And so it's wonderful that some come to Taizé for a week and then they leave again, and that was just their experience. Or they went a few times, or they took a few groups. Some people, it becomes like their regular life bud, like me. And so I end up sort of leaning into other places where it can exist. When I was in Belgium, I discovered that the KU Leuven, which is in the next town called Leuven, did a master's in theology and religious studies for like under £1,000. I know. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. And they said, yeah, and you can just, and in England, it's very strict. Like if you can't really take time out unless you're very ill, you can't take your time with it. There's some people I knew were on this same course that have been doing it for ages because they kept leaving and coming back and doing other things. And I was like, this is amazing. I will do that. And so fast forward to September 2016, and I had applied, I'd gotten in. I didn't realize they said yes to everybody. I was like, oh my God, I got in. And I had heard of I couldn't find somewhere to live. And somebody in the Poverello community said, why don't you come and stay with us here? It's only half an hour's train ride away. And I said, oh, hang on, that's different. And this is relevant to our conversation because it was like, no, hang on, I won't be a resident with 100% of my focus on this community. I will be a student staying here, even for a few months while I sort myself out, a student here going to, and I'll be studying and I won't always be available. And also, I'd kind of want a student life. I need to get to know people. And I was also at the point of realizing, I was like, well, I've not become a nun, I've noticed. And it's not something that I've felt that's driven my community experiences. But I want to keep doing this. Whatever this is, it needs to happen. And it wasn't like instead of or until I find a person. It was like, no, I want my whole life to be around this, with or without. The other alternative is I kept bumping into people who were theologians, and female theologians were quite impressive to me. And I thought maybe I could go down the academic route. So I started studying theology. Someone said to me, you know what? There is a community in Leuven attached to Belgium's national saint, which is Saint Damien of Molokai. And I was like, the Saint Damien of who? But also, sure, okay. And I went to go meet the guy who ran it, and he said, "Yes, sure, we can let you in." There's and it was in the American College, which was this massive college that was for seminarians to then be sent out into the world. And by something like I can't remember what was 2013, there were like 3 people in it, and there's like 140 rooms. And they decided to turn it over to the university. And it was student accommodation. So a lot of them, they turned whole sections into flats. And so there were loads and loads and loads. But they wanted to keep their hand in of the religious aspect. So it was it's a Catholic University of Leuven, but it's much more of a liberal university than a lot of the stuff they did was in Dutch and in Flemish, and it was like science and politics and those kind of things. And there was this little slither of international students that did theology. And then within that slither of students doing that was the ones that wanted to live in a community who weren't already monks, nuns, brothers, whatever, and sisters, and religious. And that was about 8 people who lived in one shared flat in this massive complex, which had its own chapel, but didn't have that much regular spiritual stuff happening in it. It had mass in it every so often, but it wasn't somewhere that was the center of the student life. The big common room underneath with all the games was. And so this little place had in it only English speakers. So it had Americans who were doing the philosophy course. Some of them were religious, some of them weren't. And theologians, theology students, of which were batshit mad, as usual. And there was also another flat above us who were people discerning if they wanted to become become a monk. Become a priest, a Catholic priest. And that was it. And so I joined as a student. So technically I was on my 4th community by this point. I was feeling a little bit like I've had a few under my belt. And I knew it would be for the year. So I knew we were like a cohort. We had somebody who was a student who was with us, who was sort of the head student, but it wasn't like we had a priest attached to us or we had any spiritual journey. We had some money from like a diocese, I think a US diocese, that made sure we had a meal once a year or once or twice a year. We had a retreat paid for by somebody. We went to like Belgian, well, Trappists. They have beer. We went to a Trappist place. And the idea was like maybe we'll do a prayer once a month on a Friday. Maybe we'll have a meal together once a week. Very, very light touch. I struggled with it being light touch. I had not been in a residential like that. And everyone kind of had their own life a little bit because they were studying at different levels and different things. Um, and they were there for different reasons. And there really is a difference between the sort of lived, it's almost Franciscan way of doing things to the Ignatian way, which is more like study and excellence and sort of really chasing a concept. And that's what I came across there was people who were studying theology and talking about it and being involved in it, but they hadn't any lived experience in it. And if they did, their life was somewhere else. And they had come from that. You know, one guy was in Hillsong and he'd gone through the Hillsong sort of like learning to be a leader and he was now doing a master's, but his whole life was around his Hillsong church somewhere else. And then he also happened to live with us. And they also tried to do a thing where they tried to get us once, I say they, we, one person per month would take a prayer on a Friday evening and they would do it however they wanted to. This is a group of people to whom had never really been shown any other ways, or you try and give theologians permission to do something different spiritually, and they don't really know what to do with themselves. And it was really fascinating because I was like, why don't we try this? Why don't we try that? And they were like, why would you say these things? This is really disturbing. And I was like, and it's not that they then lent into like saying that Our Father or the Rosary or anything, nothing like that. They were like, I'm going to read from my latest dissertation why I like things. And I was like, okay, lovely. Um, so that was another experience. And I also got to learn about St. Damien of Molokai, who is now one of my like personal patron saints. And it is amazing to think that they named the community after him. And if you don't know about him, look him up. But he literally gave his life knowing he would die on an island for people. Like the Molokai is this where people were sent who had leprosy in Hawaii, and he chose to go and minister to them, knowing full well he most likely get leprosy and die himself. And I was like, wow, I feel very selfish and small in with this person. He was like another member of our community to me, and I love that. Like I really invited him in, but it meant that we never talked about it as a community. And I was always curious as in, it would have been great to do a study day or like a prayer day, but so I was a member of a community at that time. I had a cohort, we did prayers, we went on retreat, but it felt like a non-residential really than a residential.
I think I've actually been to St. Damien's Church in Belgium because I'm
Yes.
half Belgian, yeah. And
Ah,
so
yeah.
I didn't recognize the name, but when you told me about the going off on an island to help people with leprosy, I'm like, oh yeah, like that he's also one of my dad's favorite saints and been to the church. Yeah. And then afterwards, after Belgium, after your master's, you came back to London.
Yeah, I had a crisis after leaving Taizé where I was like, I don't know who I am without this amazing uh like doorway into a type of spirituality that seems to be how Christians should be on a day-to-day basis. We're sharing everything and we're living together and we're loving each other in this very, very body of Christ way. And then to leave, and then it was a bit of a struggle. So the next time I had a little crisis like that was um, I didn't finish my master's. I got very sick with a undiagnosed health condition when I was out there, and it caused some serious problems for me physically, mentally, emotionally, monetarily. And I left without finishing. So I washed up again. It felt like the tide left me behind again. And I was like, right, okay, we've been here before. What do we need to do next? And I I said, God, if you want me to be a sister, let's talk about it. And we talked about it for quite a long time, the two of us. Alan Monk's with some other people. And it always made me feel a little bit sad. And I couldn't work out why. I was like, is it because whenever I talk about living in a community with other religious sisters, it's nothing like a Taizé community. It's nothing like this lay, ecumenical, lived, heartfelt experience. Like it's women, it's usually very Catholic. Like there's a sort of a difference that I was starting to really feel. Um, and I ended up moving. I was somewhere else, but I ended up moving back to London, and then I was in a relationship, and I went, right, well, that answers that question. I ain't gonna become a nun. It ain't happening. I'm with this person, and we were making big plans for the future. But yet again, there I was, walking to and from places in London and popping into churches, and I started going to like I went into churches, I went to Taizé prayers, and I was like, I need some fellowship. But also, it was almost like it's answering the call. The phone is ringing in community, and I have to reach my hand into the community to answer the phone. And when I'm in there, I'm around the people and I can do the things that are required from me. It doesn't make sense to me. And I've been psychoanalyzed a million times by all manner of people, from spiritual directors to vicars to random community friends to ex-Tezzy brothers to whatever, who were like, I think you need this because of your family, or I think you need this because of this. I'm like, or maybe it's just the way I am. I mean, I have analyzed it to death, and in the end, I was like, um, all the things you thought of, I probably thought of it too.
But also just I think I think some people it is specific call, and it's also very human. And so I think we've just forgotten how I think that is not necessarily everyone, but I don't think it's as odd as people make it out to be. I really resonate with what you just said there. And for me, there's a sense of like, yeah, this is the way that I feel like we're meant to live, or that I'm meant to live, and that we're meant to live. And there's like society going on, but we're impoverished, or I feel impoverished if I go fully that way. And so for me, it's like, I don't think it needs psychoanalyzing. I think you're just in touch with what it is to be human and to participate in the body of Christ and to be in union with God. And I guess some people can do that in a more solitary way, but I do feel like it's also, yeah, just human.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I
just
no, it's wonderful. Thank you. Honestly, there's a quote I remember reading it years ago, and I just found it. It was before this talk where it's on Sojourners, which is a website, and somebody went to Taizé in 2015 with their family. They're an older man who's there with his children, and I was volunteering that year. And he's talking about it, and this really explains it really well. But he says this great quote, and I was like, this is something that I don't know how to explain it, but I send this to people and they ask me, but why? And I go, and he says, his name is, let me just name the person, Robert Wilson Black. He says, brothers at Taizé, just by their lives together, provide a very subtle corrective to modern plagues of thin materialistic living, ambition beyond service, sexuality without meaning, demands to be relevant, and being successful at any cost. One that includes violence against humans downstream of our lives and the earth itself. And that really resonates with me across the board. And it's strange because, after I left Belgium finally in 2017, I had done work for different organizations over the years, like sort of shoring myself up. But this time I went, right, I'm living with someone and I need to be fed in this way, but I also need to feel like I'm making purpose. So, how do I live out those things without being a residential? What does it mean to live in a community? And also, what does this mean? And I knew these dispersed things existed. My grandfather and great grandmother were third order Franciscans. Um, I've got great uncles that were priests. Like it's not unusual for people to, especially in the latter parts of their lives, that my granddad was buried in his Franciscan robe, to have a personal devotion. And third order became like a personal devotion. And I was like, I don't really want third order. I kind of want to be first order, but apparently I keep being told it's not possible. So I'm
And
just going
can
to
you describe what third order is for people who are listening who might not be used to Catholic language?
It is a terminology that, to my understanding, came about when St. Francis of Assisi was trying to build his story of how people can be involved in the spiritual life. Now, in his time period, people were going to Mass, Catholic Mass in Italy, either every day or when and extra times when they needed to. But they did this thing that we do now. They came for an hour and then they left again and they got on with their life. And his life journey was so fascinating because, I don't know if anyone, do look it up if you don't know his life experience, but, he decides to, he's very, loves drama and he wants to be a famous knight and to be this person. And he comes to the realization this is not the route he needs to go down, but he takes that energy, that fighter energy with him, that sort of romantic, idealized sort of troubadour nature with him into what he does. He just approaches his spiritual life in that way. And people flocked to him. And one was, he said, well, first order is men. And for him, he said that second order was women who want to give a vow for their whole lives towards the monastic styles, which is poverty, chastity, and obedience. And a third order was basically those people that wanted to live alongside, but also had families and children, had a business, had things, but they could, in that great quote about from the Bible about, you don't pray out in the streets, you go home and you close the door because only your Father in heaven will be listening to you. And it's kind of that point, is that you live a framework and then your life comes to that, rather than you have a life and then you try and insert prayer into it. And that's the modern way of doing things. And so a third order was someone that would make a yearly vow to adhere to the Franciscan way of living. And now most religious orders have some kind of, like the big ones, like the Benedictines, they have third order people that are attached to them. And there's quite a lot of famous ones as well over the hundreds and hundreds, 800 years since this concept was first put together. So that's what a third order is in a real basic point.
Thank you. And so you were saying that you were exploring that or trying to discern.
I was trying to discern, and I was so tired. I'm not tired of discerning. It was more like lived residential lay community experience with alongside people who did a vow for a life was something that I really resonated with. And every time I came away from, when I was doing my work, I started to work in charities and working with ecumenical or interfaith projects. I just searched them out. I just Googled them. I was like, where can I find people doing the same thing? Which is, I'm now currently at the time I had a relationship with someone. I was hoping to marry them. How do I then keep my monastic line, keep my spiritual sort of community line without it being something I just did in the past, like some kind of youth group? That is what some people treat community life as like. I was like, oh no, it is a resilience building, lesson learning. Formation is painful and tough. And using the example of St. Francis of Assisi, looking up the lives of saints has really helped me, because a lot of them don't start off with like, oh, I was born into a flower and I floated down the breeze of God always spoke to me, and then something difficult happened in my life, but I was okay with it. And then when I was 15, I threw myself onto the pyre of being a this, and then by 21 I died of tuberculosis, but it's okay because I left behind this book of prayers. And I'm like, I am not that person, okay? All I'm more daydreaming, just like St. Francis did, of having a sword and riding into battle and just being this sort of like big personality. And there's a lot of, people who started communities out there who are like, I had kids, they all died in the plague. So at the age of 45, I started a community of women to help those people that were widows. And you're like, oh, actually, the story we've been told about what a holy person looks like and what a spiritual person looks like and how communities begin are very like uncomfortably pious, in a way that if you look at, say, St. Francis's life, there's many times where people told him he wasn't being pious. And actually, in his own lifetime, his own brothers, he went away to the Holy Land, he came back and they had made decisions without him, said, we don't need you anymore, you can go. And he went to a cave and was completely depressed for ages, because he's like, oh, have I missed the point? And I feel that way all the time with Jesus. I'm like, am I missing the point? Jesus is like, just keep going. I'm like, going where? So this all culminated in 2019, where I was literally Googling, are there lay communities in London? Who can I join? And this community of St. Anselm popped up out of nowhere, based in a palace I'd never heard of, attached to a denomination I was not interested in, which was Lambeth Palace, which is the home of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is the head of the Church of England, which is part of the Anglican Communion. I'm from Belfast, I'm Catholic. My family had a healthy/non-healthy relationship with England, the royal family, the Church of England. I went to a Church of England primary school and I went to a Catholic secondary school, and I felt the difference. Even though many people said they didn't really notice, I felt the difference. And that identity for me had been part of where I came from. They say you can be an atheist, but are you a Protestant atheist or a Catholic atheist in Northern Ireland? So I went for the interview with the then Dean, Simon Lewis, and I remember arriving to these big, like red gates on the side of the Thames, and I could see the Houses of Parliament over the river. And I was like, oh my God, it was like, Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore. And I remember he picked me up and we walked past this massive fig tree, and he went, that's the Catholic fig tree. It's where the last Catholic Archbishop during Mary the First, he planted that from the Vatican. And I felt a great affinity immediately for that fig tree. Never had I felt more Catholic in that moment, even though it was meant not in any way to do that. And I got in. And the way that the system worked in Community St. Anselm was that they had a core group who came for the year, which you're starting to see a theme now, that these lay communities only last a year or less. And people registered, they came and they lived on site in Lambeth Palace, and that they did prayers. They held prayers for the rest of the Lambeth Palace staff and community twice a day. In the middle of the day was a Eucharist, a Church of England Eucharist. They also had other prayers, there was other morning prayers and compline and all this kind of stuff. But the other option was to join them as a non-residential person, which is what I did. And I joined September 2019.
And so at that point you discerned that because of your current life, you wanted non-residential community after having spent a lot of your life in residential community and really loving that. So then how was that? That was your maybe first experience of non-residential community? And
Yeah.
how would you compare it with your experience of residential community? Like, did it do what you wanted it to do? Yeah. And then I guess moving forwards, well, this is stretching, but I'm wondering whether you still feel like non-residential dispersed is what you need right now in terms of your life, or whether ultimately there's still a sense of residential community is where you want to land.
It's a great question. And I feel like, especially the community of St. Anselm, which I'll call COSA from now on, I was like a step back. When I was older by this point, I was in my 30s by this point, and the age range for that community is 18 to 35. It's a very specific type of person that one finds that, and two thinks is interesting, and three comes along to it, which is different to Taizé, which is more like a gas station or a lighthouse that people stop off to. They fill up what they need, and then they go back to their communities, and they may start Taizé prayer in their community, or there's no prescription, the formation is very loose, and you can come there for many years and not get anything out of it, and then all of a sudden feel like you do, or you can slowly get drip. Whereas COSA, I realized there were some people that were there because they had a strong parish faith and they came from one place, but they felt called to learn more about themselves. They couldn't get it in their current state. They didn't know what they were getting at COSA, but they wanted to get that. The other part was those people that were there for ambition. Lambeth Palace, Archbishop of Canterbury, these are big things. If you are someone who wants to be to become a vicar, a lot of people became vicars going through COSA. If you were someone that wanted to just be seen or to have it on your CV, there's a couple of people like that. More of them in the non-residential than the residential. There are some people that saw it as a place to be able to get in their foot into England and to London because there was no other way they could do it. You know, they come from other countries that were quite far away. And there were some that came from places that were persecuted or where being Christian was not the majority. And the possibility of being somewhere where they could just relax and just be a Christian with other Christians and other young people, which means as you start to notice, someone who's interested in community life knows what it is and then joins it is not a majority, like not even, it's very rare. So I knew that people would come into it feeling intense. There would be big emotions. There would be lots of personal revelations, and people would leave feeling lost. Because that's maybe how I felt. Not everybody, but some people. And there were lots of people that came through it who had no onward place to go, like I did when I first went to Taizé to be a volunteer. I had no plans. I was like, well, God sent me here. Maybe God will send me somewhere else. But actually, it's like a hot house. It's hot housing an experience. And each one of the experiences I've had have been different. And COSA is yet again a different one. And the Church of England has its own issues with monasticism. Please see the history of the world and this country that I'm currently living in to understand that. But, you know, pilgrimages were banned, the connections with the Catholic Church and, you know, like monks and nuns ended up living in other countries. Like, this is historical, but it means that the Church of England doesn't have this. And so they've gotten this whole idea of new monasticism and tried to bring it into a place that was a bit like an ambassador's house crossed with the House of Commons, crossed with like it's very political. And you put a bunch of young people who are from different cultures and different backgrounds in the middle of that and stir it and hope that they come out the other side not feeling like they've just been through a washing machine. No matter how pretty the building is or how good that victory is.
So basically, because of your experience in community, you're like, no, I'm not going to do the residential. I know what that's going to be. Or
no, it was because I was in a relationship, a long-term relationship with someone that didn't believe in God. And this was like my way. I was like, I need community. If I join a parish community, that's 1 hour a week. I need more. I knew that I needed something that felt like we were on an adventure together. Like, you know, when a group of people in a film, you know, like Lord of the Rings, it's like we need to go on this trip together. And I like intergenerational work a lot, but I'm very drawn towards youth ministry. And so working around young people was very part of it. Also, I was looking for spiritual friends. I sort of struggled a little bit in just Catholic spaces or just Anglican spaces or just whatever is because sometimes in those places, yet again, it was the ones that were super keen. Whereas ecumenism seems to bring people together who are like willing to bridge differences and willing to come to the table and want peace. Some people come to church and they don't want peace. They're looking to prove that they're right. And I wasn't looking for that. So I ended up joining non-residential because I lived with a man, and halfway through lockdown happened and everything had to go online. And suddenly my community life that which at the time was I went out Monday evenings to Lambeth Palace and I prayed there with a group. And then we had the odd Saturday. But none of this touched my partner in any way, his life. Then came the lockdown. And then suddenly I'm doing COSA in the house. And he was like, who are these people and what are you doing? And then when they asked us if anyone wanted to help, they were asking about how we felt about the year. And I was like, oh, it feels like it was so short. And the COSA leadership said, oh, would you like to come back next year and support the work that we do? And I was like, yes, because that's kind of the next stage is that I'm sort of floating about in this sort of volunteering space constantly. And I'm actually more in a sort of ops logistical sort of stage now where I can see it all a little bit clearer. And so I came back and I supported the non-residentials again. And I remember them saying, we're going to send you your robe so that you can wear it when we do the robing ceremony. I had to also renew my vow as a member of the community. And I said to my boyfriend, I was like, I'm going to do this thing and here's the robe and I'm going to wear it and I'm going to say some stuff. And I need to know how one, you feel about it, but two, will you support me in it? Which means you sit and listen to it. And he was like, why would I do that? And I was like, okay, that's fine. Because I was so used to people living like it was rare, like you yourself and Damaris are rare entity in community life. Either you meet people in community and you understand it. If you meet someone separately, it's so hard to explain it. And then they asked me back for another year. So suddenly I've been doing it for 3 years, and he only came. I invited him to the last vowing, which was the ceremony we revowed at the beginning of my third year. It's the first time he'd been to the palace. It was by this point lockdowns had all finished, and he was like completely confused about this whole group of people who knew me. He's like, "How do they know you?" I was like, "What do you think I've been doing?" And it was so hard to explain it. But it also, I recognized how it was so niche within the niche within the niche. Like you end up getting a bit lost in the circle of like explaining to somebody the basics, which is I'm a Christian, therefore I put on a robe 3 times a day and I pray in my living room. What does that mean? So yeah, the relationship didn't last. And therefore I ended up in the state I'm in now, which is I'm doing all of the charity work and organizational work that I'm doing with faith groups in different ways. I'm still doing that. And always feeling a little bit like it's a long time since I've had a certain meal. I go, that community meal, I haven't had it in a while. And it's not fed by friendships. It's not fed by church, even though I get fed by both of those things. It's not fed by family. It's a different thing. It really is a different flavor. Back to the stock cube at the beginning.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And sometimes I feel like, should I be able to get this from church like once a week? But the reality is I don't. Yeah, and so I appreciate you articulating, and I think it is what brings people to community. Well, you've also mentioned the different reasons why people might come to a 1-year opportunity at Lambeth, but people who seek community in the long run. Yeah. And then now you're looking into the Nazareth community, which would enable you to pray with people near daily.
Yeah, the Nazareth community, I'm sure you'll have someone else who will on here who will talk more about it, but it's a community. Oh, of course, you've got Reverend Richard Carter as well as a person to talk about, but his experiences of lived community, really living it, like taking the vows, the celibacy, all that stuff, and then coming to London, which is a big smorgasbord of madness, and trying to find that is exactly, I know that feeling. And his story is, when he did come and he was at St. Martin in the Fields Church in Trafalgar Square, right in the centre of London, which is a strong homeless outreach. And he realized that actually he could build a community right in the middle of this mess. He didn't have to go out and live in the middle of nowhere to do it. He could do it right there. And that's something I really resonates with me with the Taizé community, is to go where you're needed, not where you feel comfortable. And I'd heard about this community on and off for a number of years. And, with the ending of St. Anselm, the coastal community became too old, but also life changes. It really is only meant to be for like an 8-month stint, that community. That the Nazareth is completely dispersed. There are some people that go to St. Martin in the Fields as a church. There are some people that live and work nearby and go to their own churches. There are some people that live abroad. And so it has an online dispersed community, as an in-person dispersed community. And they all come together at certain times of the year. And I just found myself, when I was working in London, going into their service, which is an open service to anyone that wanted to wander in on a Wednesday evening, called Bread for the World, which is an Anglican service. And afterwards, meeting a bunch of people that seemed like me. I was like, oh, but they're all professionals. Whereas a lot of the lived community experiences I've been having had been with people that were students in transition, about to become wanting to study to become a vicar, were looking for their long-term hobby. Those sorts of people who are in transition. The people at Nazareth community are actually, it supplements their life. And that's not how I believe that community should be at all. But I recognize that in myself, that I have slowly but surely come to the realization that that would be useful at this point in my life. Doesn't mean I won't wander off and live in a community at some point in the future, and doesn't mean also that I've not heavily discerned religious life again, because I had to. I was like, this is nuts. Look how many communities I've got under my belt. Hopefully, dear listeners, you've come on this journey with me and Lakshmi, poor Lakshmi, and not at any point screamed at whatever device you're listening to this on and gone, why didn't you just become a nun? Why not? And that's a misunderstanding of what lay community is like, especially when it's co-ed, like it's both genders. All women's spaces I find very stressful. So after a while, I feel very like I struggle in them. And all male ones, obviously, I'm a woman in that space, it's not ideal. Lay communities are often both. And I know there's always that deep fear people have immediately. They're like, yes, but men and women living together. Like, yeah, if you're 18, okay. But to be honest, like, and this is what I learned from the Taizé community. They're like, look, if you feel after a few weeks or months that you just need to boink, maybe leave the community. Maybe don't volunteer. The whole world is outside, okay? This is not the world. This is the pit stop. And I think some lived communities get a bit stuck on themselves where they're like, no, 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 we are the answer. So you have to adhere to the rules specifically to be able to get the goods. And I'm not sure if that is an approach that is healthy in the long run.
And so at this point, do you have a sense of what ideally you'd want from community? Because there's frustration around recognizing the place of short-term young adult formation communities. And so they have their place, but they leave people hanging at the end, potentially. And then if you have had a great experience, there's no way of extending it. On the other end of the spectrum, you can have communities like the one you experienced in Belgium, where you're living together, but the rhythms are so loose that is it really a community? Would you say there's a longing for communities where you can work your professional life, but you're coming back to community of meals, of prayer? Or do you think you'd also one day drop the professional and just live in a community who's running, say, a retreat center, who offer ways of doing that long term?
It is the perennial question that my family often ask me.
Apologies.
No, it's a great one because the idea has always been since I first came across this was to live in Taizé. Like in some ways, I was always hoping that I could like live it or live nearby or be part of an ecumenical residential community, which I could donate my life to. I was never really attached to like, am I in a relationship or not? Do I need that or not? There was a part of me that always felt like maybe I wanted both. So this is why I didn't then lean into, vowing to be a long-term sister, when in my 20s. But I think the ideal is that there's lots of different ways and different approaches to it, and understanding the charism is really, really key. Because once you know why you're doing it, you can always refer back to it. And then also assuming that all communities are the same. Like there's people that live mainly in silence and they do their work together. And then there are some that go and they are like basically Samaritans and they listen to people all the time. There are some that go and they're teachers. And I know that they do this with the Catholic workers. They have the Catholic worker houses where people can live together and work, but they are also they can be quite temporary themselves because people come and go to this style of faith. My idea would be that like, oh, the beguiners, the sort of the Begeinhofs, it's not the right word, but to have like a place where people can, like a little island within a city where it's not just a house, it's like a living space, which is dedicated to people who want to live in that way. And therefore you can have people that live in their own house and they live there 20 years, you have people that live there and they live there 20 minutes. As long as you abide by the rules, you're allowed into the walls. But it's not always, I understand this, I really understand this thing of temporary. And the irony is I have lived a temporarily permanent life of going around communities. So I don't really know the answer to that. If I could word, I would say to you the ideal. I recognize very much now I'm living in a suburban town in England. I'm not in London anymore. How much people hunger for formation after in adulthood. They don't get it so much from their small groups or from their 1 hour at church. Its concept of daily prayer and daily silence is an alien thing. There's thousands of courses out there for someone to follow. There's loads of prayers out there. You can just Google like Benedictine Oblate prayer for the day, and people still struggle to just do it because they need to do it in a community. So there is an element of maybe coming together as a group first, building those relationships being with each other, being accountable, recognizing who you're praying for and what their life is like. And then when maybe that cycle is over, you still sign up for 2 years, for example, or even longer to continue the cycle, but you feed back into the people at the beginning so that there's a cycle of service and care. And it's not just about, sometimes I think of the irony of art and music therapists who've never had therapy before, and they start studying for their therapy sessions. They're like, wow, I didn't know I needed this. And a lot of people I feel sometimes come to community lived experiences coming from pain from the church or coming from something, and they work it out in with this group of people that also need support. That is sometimes not there. You know, sometimes you need an actual external psychologist who can just come in every so often and go, what do you guys need? Sometimes you really do need a really healthy chaplain or multiple chaplains to be a listening ear for someone who's never been revealed to themselves except when they live in close proximity to people who are not their family or their chosen partner. And they're like, oh my gosh, I now can't get away from myself. Who am I? And then that has to always constantly be like, and where is God in all of this? Where does God lead? I've just started, well, I'm halfway through doing a course in becoming a spiritual director. And I think that comes about from years of being in these communities and this constantly being the question, are you leaning towards God or leaning away from God? What's a good decision versus a great decision versus a best decision? Like, let's try and understand the words negative and bad and wrong. I get that, but there's also an element of like, you are a lived ecology within other lived ecologies. How do you do that in a community? And people realizing they're like, how? I didn't know I could do community in my family group. I didn't know I'm a part of a community in that way. I was like, yes, that's the point. Is any group of people, two or more gathered in my name, then Jesus is there. Boom, community. Be intentional with it. And they're like, is it really that simple? I'm like, yes, it is. Really is that simple. How am I showing up today? Am I leaning towards God, leaning away? And sometimes leaning towards God or leaning towards spirituality requires you to have that difficult conversation, requires you to get angry, requires you to work out, oh, did I do something wrong? Rather than the sweep under the carpet that faith often does, that community often struggles with. And I think being able to do difficult stuff well is how ecumenism works well in a lived setting.
Yeah, and in this, it's been very beautiful to hear of your charism towards ecumenism. So speaking about the charisms of different communities and monastic communities, what I'm hearing is also a sense of like, I know that I have this charism towards ecumenism and trying to find a space where you can live into that.
Yeah. Answers on a postcard if anyone knows.
I'll talk to you after we start recording. And on this theme of leaning towards God, I was wondering whether we can wrap up with asking you where you find God dwelling especially richly. So this podcast is called Dwelling Place after Psalm 84. But how lovely is your dwelling place? My heart faints for the courts of the Lord. And so where is it that you find God dwelling especially richly in intentional Christian community?
I love that song because this idea that I have great longing. There's a word in Portuguese, sorry, Portuguese people, I don't know how to pronounce it, saudade, which is like a word that cannot be translated into English, which is a combination of like nostalgic longing and yearning. It's like there's nothing more that you can say. There's no other way to say it. And this idea that my heart aches for the courts, for the place, not just like the place where you dwell, as in the room or the church or the silence. People always go very romanticized about their week in silence or their retreats away or when they got away. I'm like, the court of the Lord is exactly where I am. So who am I in that room? Because the court's got a jester as well as it's got, people who are plotting to kill the king, especially people who are not caring, people who are there because it's a family thing. It's like, who am I in that space and how do I long for a space where if Jesus really is on the throne of my heart, then how is my whole being around that? How is my body and spirit and soul the ground in which the court exists? And who are the major players? And so, I mean, quite clearly, God's dwells in the places where communion exists. And then one level up from that would be conversation, connection, and communion. And those wonderful places are very slow. I'm a very fast person. And so God dwells in the stillness and the slowness and really is a very quiet voice. But all these community experiences and all the church experiences that I've had and all the interfaith I've had have led me to be attuned. And I know when I'm not attuned because I get more resentful, more irritated. I can't see my place in the court, or I'm demanding that I'm meant to have a certain place. Always returning to the provisional and the temporary, which is, hey, 1 week you're the court jester, sometimes you're somewhere else, but you don't absent yourself from where God dwells, because that's where alignment is. It's where the resonation is. It's, you know, it's where the phone's ringing. Just get in there and pick it up.
On that note, that beautiful circular note. Thank you very much, Sorcha.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.